world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Perfect Family Dinner. Russell Klein adjusted his tie as he pulled into his in-laws' circular driveway, the mansion's colonial facade gleaming under the evening sun. Beside him, his wife Tracy fidgeted with her phone, typing furiously. In the back seat, their 7-year-old daughter Emma swung her legs, humming softly. "Put the phone away, honey," Russell said quietly, his steel-gray eyes meeting Tracy's in the rearview mirror. "Your parents hate when you're distracted during dinner." Tracy's fingers hesitated over the screen before she slipped the device into her purse. "You're right. Sorry." Russell had been married to Tracy Chandler Klein for 9 years, and her family's monthly dinners had become a sacred tradition. Douglas Chandler, a retired federal judge, and his wife Francine had welcomed Russell into their family with open arms when he'd married their only daughter. They saw him as the successful architect who'd given Tracy the stability they'd always wanted for her. If only they knew the truth about their precious daughter. The Chandler family home was a testament to old money and judicial prestige. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors lined the hallways. Douglas had inherited the house from his father, also a judge, and the weight of legal tradition seemed to permeate every room. "Russell, my boy," Douglas boomed as they entered, his imposing frame filling the doorway. Even at 72, the former judge commanded respect with his silver hair and sharp blue eyes. "How's the business? That shopping complex project still keeping you busy?" "Busier than ever," Russell replied, shaking his father-in-law's firm hand. "The city approved our expansion plans last week." Francine emerged from the kitchen, her elegant gray hair perfectly styled, wearing pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. "Emma, sweetheart, come give Grandma a hug." Emma rushed into her grandmother's arms, chattering about school and her friends. Russell watched his daughter with a mixture of love and careful calculation. Emma was the only innocent party in this house, and he intended to keep it that way. Dinner proceeded as it always did. Francine had prepared her signature pot roast, and the conversation flowed between Russell's architectural projects, Douglas's golf game, and Emma's upcoming school play. Tracy seemed more animated than usual, laughing at her father's stories and asking her mother about the book club. Russell observed everything with the precision of a man who'd learned to read people like blueprints. Tracy's nervous energy, the way she kept glancing at her purse, the slight flush in her cheeks when her phone buzzed during dessert. "Excuse me," Tracy said, standing abruptly. "I need to use the powder room." Russell nodded and continued his conversation with Douglas about property values. But part of his mind tracked Tracy's footsteps. She was heading upstairs, not to the downstairs bathroom. To text him, no doubt. Austin Hurley, personal trainer at Tracy's gym. 28 years old, all muscles and charm and empty promises. Russell had discovered their affair 3 months ago, and since then, he'd been building something beautiful, something devastating. "Daddy," Emma whispered, tugging at his sleeve. "I dropped my napkin." "Here, sweetheart." Russell handed her his own napkin and watched her crawl under the table to retrieve hers. That's when she saw it. Emma's small gasp was barely audible, but Russell caught it. His daughter's face went pale as she climbed back in her chair, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to leave. Now," she whispered urgently in his ear. Russell leaned down, his voice calm and controlled. "What happened, Emma? You didn't look under the table." Russell made a show of bending down to look, his hand brushing against the manila envelope he'd carefully taped there earlier that week. Inside were photographs, bank statements, and a letter, all meticulously crafted to tell a very specific story. He sat back up, his face a mask of concerned confusion. "Douglas, there's something under your table." An envelope. The former judge's eyebrows furrowed as Russell handed him the package. Douglas opened it with the same careful precision he'd once used to review court documents. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, horror, and finally, cold fury. "What is this?" Douglas's voice was deadly quiet. The photographs showed Tracy and Austin in various compromising positions, but that wasn't the damning part. The bank statements showed a joint account Russell had never seen before. The letter, written in Tracy's handwriting, Russell had practiced for weeks to perfect her script, detailed plans to disappear with Austin and Emma after Russell's accident. I don't understand, Russell said, his voice carefully modulated to show the right amount of shock and betrayal. Francine looked at the documents, her hand flying to her throat. Oh my God, Tracy's been planning to kill me, Russell finished quietly. And take Emma. The sound of Tracy's heels on the stairs signaled her return. She walked into the dining room with a smile that died the moment she saw the envelope's contents spread across the table. What's all this? She asked, but her voice had already changed. Russell could hear the fear creeping in. Douglas stood slowly, his judicial training taking over. Tracy Chandler Klein, I think you need to explain these documents. Tracy's eyes darted between the papers and Russell's face. She was quick, he'd give her that. Quick enough to realize she was trapped, but not quick enough to see how carefully the trap had been constructed. This isn't. Russell, you know I would never. Know what, Tracy? Russell's voice was ice. Know that you've been sleeping with Austin Hurley for 6 months? Know that you've been planning to fake my death and disappear with our daughter? Which part should I know? Emma looked between her parents, confusion and fear warring on her small face. Russell reached over and gently squeezed her hand. It's going to be okay, sweetheart. Daddy's going to take care of everything. 5 hours later, after the police had been called, after Tracy had been arrested on charges of conspiracy to commit murder and attempted kidnapping, Russell sat in Douglas's study with his former father-in-law. I'm sorry you had to see this, son, Douglas said quietly. I can't believe my own daughter. Neither can I, Russell replied, accepting the glass of whiskey. But we have to think about Emma now. She's been through enough. Douglas nodded grimly. You'll have my full support in the custody proceedings. After tonight, he shook his head. Tracy will never see that child again if I have anything to say about it. Russell sipped his whiskey and stared out the window into the darkness. Phase 1 was complete. Tracy was in custody, her reputation destroyed, her family turned against her. But this was just the beginning. Austin Hurley had no idea what was coming for him. Chapter 2. The Architect's Blueprint. 3 months earlier, Russell Klein had been a successful man living what he thought was a successful life. His architectural firm, Klein & Associates, had just won the contract for the city's largest commercial development in decades. His wife was beautiful, his daughter was brilliant, and his bank account reflected 15 years of smart investments and harder work. That Tuesday morning in March had started like any other. Russell was reviewing blueprints in his downtown office when his assistant, Leah Atwood, knocked on his door. Mr. Klein? Your wife's gym called. She left her car keys in the locker room, and they're closing early for maintenance. They asked if you could pick them up. Russell had kissed Tracy goodbye that morning as she headed to her Pilates class, the same routine they'd maintained for 3 years. She always drove herself to the gym, always came home refreshed and glowing. He'd never questioned it. The Fitness Elite Gym was a high-end facility in the suburbs, all glass and chrome, and membership fees that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Russell had signed Tracy up there as an anniversary gift, thinking the yoga and Pilates classes would help with her chronic stress. I'm here for my wife's keys, Russell told the receptionist, a young woman with elaborate nail art who barely looked up from her phone. Tracy Klein, right? Austin said to tell you she's in the massage room if you want to grab her. Russell felt the first cold touch of suspicion. Tracy had never mentioned massages. He followed the receptionist's directions down a hallway lined with motivational posters and the sound of expensive exercise equipment. The massage room door was slightly ajar. Russell could hear Tracy's voice, breathless, and saying things he'd never heard her say to him. When he peered through the crack, he saw his wife of 9 years straddling a man who definitely wasn't a licensed massage therapist. Austin Hurley was everything Russell wasn't. Young where Russell was mature, impulsive where Russell was calculated, all raw physicality where Russell was refined intelligence. Tracy was moving above him with an abandon Russell hadn't seen since their honeymoon. Russell watched for exactly 30 seconds, memorizing every detail with the precision that had made him a successful architect. Then he walked away, retrieved Tracy's keys from the front desk, and drove home to wait. When Tracy returned that evening, flushed and claiming her Pilates instructor had really pushed the class hard, Russell kissed her cheek and asked about her day. She lied smoothly, mentioning the difficulty of the poses and how sore she felt. That night, as Tracy slept beside him, Russell stared at the ceiling and began to plan. The investigation phase had taken Russell 2 weeks. He was methodical by nature, and betrayal had only sharpened that focus. He hired a private investigator, Tyrone Wise, a former police detective who specialized in matrimonial cases. Within days, Russell had photos, timestamps, hotel receipts, and phone records. Tracy and Austin had been conducting their affair with the casual arrogance of people who thought they were smarter than everyone around them. They used Austin's apartment, cheap motels on the outskirts of town, and even Tracy's car in various parking lots. The pattern showed escalation, from stolen hours to full afternoons, from hidden conversations to elaborate lies about shopping trips and book clubs. But Russell wanted more than just evidence of adultery. He wanted total destruction. "You sure about this path, Mr. Klein?" Tyrone had asked during their final meeting. The detective was a large black man in his 50s, with intelligent eyes and the careful demeanor of someone who'd seen humanity at its worst. "Divorce court would give you everything you want. Full custody, alimony, the works. This other route, it's dangerous." Russell had studied the man across from him. Tyrone Wise had 23 years with the city police, a spotless record, and a reputation for discretion. But he also had 2 teenage daughters and a wife who'd been battling cancer. Medical bills, college tuition, and a detective's pension didn't add up to financial security. "Mr. Wise, how much would it be worth to you to ensure my daughter never has to question whether her mother loved her enough to stay?" The conversation that followed had established Russell's true nature. He wasn't interested in winning. He was interested in total annihilation. Tracy had broken something fundamental when she chose Austin Hurley over their family, and Russell intended to break something fundamental in return. The plan Russell constructed was architectural in its complexity. Every element supported the others. Every detail served multiple purposes, and the foundation was built on Tracy's own weaknesses. Phase 1 required patience. Russell began documenting Tracy's lies, recording their conversations, and building a timeline that would later support his narrative. He opened a secret bank account in Tracy's name, making deposits that matched her gym visits. He practiced her handwriting until he could forge her signature flawlessly. Phase 2 involved Austin Hurley directly. Russell learned everything about the young man, his background, his debts, his dreams, his fears. Austin was from a working-class family in Ohio, had dropped out of college to pursue a fitness career, and was deeply in debt from a failed supplement business. He was exactly the kind of desperate man who might believe he'd found his meal ticket in a lonely suburban housewife. Russell began showing up at the gym, not to confront anyone, but to establish himself as a presence. He took out a membership, started working with a different trainer, and made friends with the staff. He learned the schedules, the routines, the gossip. "Austin's a good kid," the gym manager, Santos Keenan, had told Russell one evening. "Little naive, maybe. Falls for the hard luck stories, you know? Always trying to help people out of tight spots." Perfect. Austin was a rescuer, a white knight looking for damsels in distress. Tracy must have played that role beautifully. The neglected wife, the misunderstood woman trapped in a loveless marriage with a cold, successful husband. Phase 3 was the masterpiece. Russell planted the seeds of the idea slowly, carefully. A comment here about feeling threatened by a client. A mention there about updating his will. He let Tracy overhear a phone call about increasing his life insurance policy. The joint bank account required more finesse. Russell needed Tracy to believe she was being clever, that she was preparing for their future together without Russell's knowledge. He arranged for Austin to discover investment opportunities that required initial capital, then sat back and watched Tracy drain her personal accounts to fund them. The forged letter was Russell's crowning achievement. Written in Tracy's handwriting, it detailed plans for Russell's accident, complete with Austin's promise to help her start fresh somewhere else with Emma. The plan was plausible enough to be believable, but sloppy enough to be discovered. All Russell needed was the perfect moment to spring the trap. The dinner at his in-laws' house provided that moment. Douglas Chandler's judicial background would lend credibility to the discovery, and Francine's emotional reaction would eliminate any doubt about Tracy's guilt. Emma's innocent witnessing of the evidence would seal the case. As Russell sat in his home office the night before the dinner, reviewing the final details of his plan, he felt no guilt. Tracy had made her choice when she decided to betray their family. Austin had made his choice when he decided to pursue a married woman with a child. Now, they would face the consequences of those choices. Russell Kline had spent his career building structures that would last. Tomorrow, he would demonstrate that he was equally skilled at tearing them down. Chapter 3. The Trap Springs. The holding cell at the city jail was nothing like the movies made it seem. Tracy Kline sat on a narrow bench, still wearing the navy dress she'd chosen for her parents' dinner, her hands shaking as she tried to process what had just happened. The charges were serious: conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and fraud. The prosecution was arguing that she and Austin had planned to kill Russell and flee the country with Emma and Russell's life insurance money. "This is insane," Tracy whispered to her court-appointed attorney, a tired-looking woman named Madeline Sanford who'd been assigned to the case at midnight. "I've never seen those documents before in my life." Madeline reviewed the evidence file with a weary expression of someone who'd heard similar claims hundreds of times. "Mrs. Kline, the handwriting analysis on this letter shows a 94% match to your known samples. The bank account has your signature on the opening documents. And these photographs." Tracy couldn't look at the photos again. Seeing herself with Austin, captured in moments she'd thought were private, made her feel physically sick. But those intimate images weren't what would destroy her. They were just the foundation for something much worse. "Someone's setting me up," Tracy insisted. Russell's done this somehow." "Your husband? The man who called the police? The man whose in-laws witnessed him discovering evidence of your alleged plot to murder him?" Madeline's skepticism was obvious. "Mrs. Kline, I need you to focus on reality here. We need to discuss plea options." Down the hall, Russell Kline was giving his statement to Detective Oscar Schultz, a 20-year veteran of the force who specialized in domestic crimes. Russell's performance was flawless: the shocked husband, the concerned father, the betrayed man struggling to understand how his wife could plan such violence. "I keep thinking about Emma," Russell said, his voice cracking slightly. "She's the one who found the envelope. What if Tracy had gone through with this? What if my daughter had lost both parents?" Detective Schultz nodded sympathetically. "Mr. Kline, I know this is difficult, but we need to go through the timeline again. When did you first suspect your wife might be having an affair?" Russell had rehearsed this conversation 100 times. "I didn't want to believe it. There were little signs: phone calls she wouldn't answer in front of me, unexplained absences, mood changes. But I thought maybe she was planning a surprise or going through something personal. I never imagined this." The detective's questions continued for 2 hours, covering every aspect of Russell's marriage, his relationship with his in-laws, and his discovery of the evidence. Russell answered with the measured responses of a man trying to be helpful while processing devastating news. "What about this Austin Hurley? Did you know him before tonight?" "I'd seen him at the gym a few times. Tracy mentioned he was her trainer, but I thought it was just professional." Russell paused, as if remembering something painful. "Actually, now that I think about it, she did start working out more frequently about 6 months ago. She said she wanted to get in shape for our 10th anniversary next year." While Russell was cementing his victim narrative with the police, Austin Hurley was having the worst night of his life. He'd been arrested at his apartment at 2 a.m., pulled from his bed by police officers who'd informed him he was wanted for conspiracy to commit murder. "I don't understand what's happening," Austin told his attorney, a public defender named Julius Haynes who looked barely older than Austin himself. "Tracy and we never talked about hurting anyone. We were in love." Julius reviewed the case file with growing alarm. "Mr. Hurley, they have bank records showing payments from Mrs. Kline to you totaling over $40,000. They have recorded conversations between you two discussing her husband's life insurance policy. And they have this letter allegedly written by Mrs. Klein, that explicitly mentions your involvement in planning Mr. Klein's death. Austin felt like he was drowning. The money. Tracy said she wanted to invest in my business. She was helping me start a new gym. And we never. She complained about her husband sometimes, said he was cold and controlling, but we never planned to hurt anyone. What about the life insurance discussions? She mentioned that Russell had increased his policy recently. She thought it was strange, said he'd been acting paranoid about his safety. But we never. God, I would never hurt anyone. The evidence against both Tracy and Austin was overwhelming. But the case had one significant flaw that neither defendant nor their attorneys had yet recognized. Russell Klein was the only source for most of the crucial information. The letter had been discovered by Russell. The bank account information had been provided by Russell's financial advisor, who noticed suspicious activity on Tracy's accounts. The recordings of allegedly incriminating conversations had been made by Russell's security system. Detective Schultz was thorough, but he was also looking at what appeared to be a straightforward case of domestic betrayal turned deadly. A cheating wife, her lover, and a plot to murder the husband for insurance money. It was a story he'd seen variations of throughout his career. The evidence is solid, Schultz told his partner, Detective Crystal Fuller, as they reviewed the case the next morning. Klein's story checks out. The physical evidence supports everything he's told us, and both defendants have motive and opportunity. Fuller, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 40s, was more skeptical. Something feels too neat about this. The husband just happens to find all this evidence on the same night. His 7-year-old daughter just happens to spot the envelope under the table. Sometimes cases are straightforward, Fuller. Not everything's a conspiracy. Meanwhile, Russell was meeting with his attorney, Wendell Warren, a partner at the city's most prestigious law firm. Warren specialized in family law and had a reputation for protecting his clients' interests with ruthless efficiency. The criminal charges against your wife make the divorce proceedings much simpler, Warren explained. Full custody of Emma is virtually guaranteed, and given the circumstances, you'll likely be awarded the majority of marital assets. Russell nodded, playing the part of the grieving husband. I just want what's best for Emma. She's been through enough trauma already. Of course. We'll also need to discuss the life insurance policy you mentioned. Since Mrs. Klein won't be able to claim it due to her alleged plot, you'll want to update the beneficiaries. The insurance policy was another carefully constructed element of Russell's plan. He'd increased the coverage and made sure Tracy knew about it, planting the seed that would later support the prosecution's motive theory. By the end of the week, the local media had picked up the story. Suburban mom plotted husband's murder read the headline in the city paper, accompanied by photos of Tracy and Austin being led away in handcuffs. Russell gave a carefully worded statement to reporters, emphasizing his concern for Emma and his shock at discovering his wife's alleged betrayal. I'm focusing on my daughter right now, he told the cameras. She's lost her mother to this situation, and I want to help her heal and move forward. Emma, meanwhile, was staying with her grandparents Douglas and Francine, who were struggling to process their daughter's arrest. Russell visited daily, the concerned father checking on his traumatized child. She keeps asking when mommy's coming home, Francine told Russell through her tears. What do I tell her? The truth, as gently as possible, Russell replied. That mommy made some very bad choices, and now she has to face the consequences. Douglas had used his judicial connections to stay informed about the case progress. The evidence is damning, he told Russell privately. I can't believe I raised a daughter capable of this. Russell put a comforting hand on the older man's shoulder. None of us could have predicted this. Tracy fooled us all. As the weeks passed, Russell's plan continued to unfold perfectly. Tracy and Austin were denied bail due to the severity of the charges. Their attorneys struggled to mount a defense against evidence that seemed ironclad. The media painted them as cold-blooded conspirators who'd plotted to destroy a family for money and lust. But Russell wasn't finished. Phase 1 had been about destroying Tracy and Austin legally and socially. Phase 2 would be about ensuring their complete and permanent ruin. The architect was just getting started. Chapter 4. Foundations Crumble. 6 weeks after the arrests, The case against Tracy Klein and Austin Hurley was proceeding exactly as Russell had designed. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Douglas Burnett, was confident they had enough evidence for first-degree murder conspiracy charges that could result in life sentences. Russell attended every hearing, playing the role of the devastated husband seeking justice. He sat in the front row, often holding hands with Emma when she accompanied him. The picture of a father protecting his child from the consequences of her mother's evil choices. Tracy looked increasingly desperate at each appearance. The designer clothes had been replaced by orange jumpsuits. The carefully styled hair hung limp and unwashed, and the confidence that had once defined her had evaporated entirely. She tried to catch Russell's eye during proceedings, but he looked through her as if she were already dead. Austin was faring even worse. The young man who'd been all swagger and charm was now a hollow-eyed shadow, his attorneys struggling to explain away the mounting evidence. His family had driven down from Ohio for the first hearing, but hadn't returned. The shame was too much. Russell's next move was surgical in its precision. He arranged to meet privately with Austin's attorney, Julius Haynes, at a coffee shop downtown. "I wanted to speak with you about your client," Russell said, sliding into the booth across from the young lawyer. "I think there might be a way to resolve this situation that serves everyone's interests." Julius looked suspicious. "Mr. Klein, I'm not sure it's appropriate for us to be having this conversation without my client present. I understand your concern, but I'm here as a father, not just a victim. Emma has been through hell, and I want to minimize her exposure to a lengthy trial." Russell leaned forward, his voice taking on the reasonable tone that had made him successful in business. "Your client was manipulated by my wife. I can see that now. Austin's young, naive, and he fell for an older woman's lies. Tracy convinced him I was abusive, didn't she? That she was trapped and needed rescuing." Julius shifted uncomfortably. Austin had indeed claimed that Tracy had painted her marriage as abusive, describing Russell as controlling and emotionally distant. "I'm willing to consider a plea arrangement," Russell continued. "Austin cooperates fully, testifies against Tracy about how she manipulated him into the relationship and planted the ideas about the insurance money. In exchange, I'll recommend that the prosecutor consider reduced charges." "And what exactly would you want my client to say?" Russell smiled coldly. "The truth. That Tracy was the mastermind, that she seduced him and gradually introduced the idea of getting rid of me. That he went along with it because he believed her lies about being abused." The meeting lasted an hour, and by the end, Julius was considering the proposal. Austin was facing life in prison, but if he testified against Tracy and accepted responsibility for being manipulated, he might see freedom again in 15 years. Russell's psychological warfare against Tracy was more subtle but equally devastating. He arranged for Emma to visit her mother in jail, but only under strict supervision and with carefully planned conversations. "Daddy says you made bad choices, Mommy," Emma said during one visit, her innocent words hitting Tracy like physical blows. "He says that's why you can't come home." Tracy tried to explain, to find words that would help her 7-year-old daughter understand that Mommy wasn't the monster everyone said she was. But how do you explain adultery and frame jobs to a child who still believes in fairy tales? "Sweetheart, Mommy loves you more than anything in the world," Tracy said through tears. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, but I would never hurt Daddy. Never." Emma looked confused. "But Daddy showed me the letter you wrote. You said bad things about him." Tracy felt the walls closing in. Russell was using their daughter as a weapon, poisoning Emma's mind against her own mother with surgical precision. After each visit, Russell would debrief Emma carefully, framing the conversations in ways that supported his narrative. "Mommy seemed upset that we found her letter," Russell would say. "She probably wishes she hadn't written down her plans." Meanwhile, Russell was systematically destroying any potential support systems Tracy might have had. He reached out to her friends from the book club, the yoga class, and their neighborhood social circle. "I wanted you to hear this from me rather than the news," he told Rhonda Berger, Tracy's closest friend. "The police found evidence that Tracy and her friend were planning to kill me and take Emma." The reactions were predictably shocked. These were suburban women who lived comfortable lives insulated from serious crime. The idea that one of their own could be capable of murder conspiracy was incomprehensible. "I can't believe it," Rhonda said. "Tracy never seemed. I mean, she complained about your work schedule sometimes, but planning murder?" Russell's voice carried just the right note of betrayed confusion. "I keep trying to understand how I missed the signs. How long was she planning this? How could I have been so blind?" One by one, Tracy's friends abandoned her. The woman they'd known for years, the devoted mother, the volunteer at Emma's school, the neighbor who brought casseroles when someone was sick, was replaced in their minds by the monster depicted in the news. The isolation was complete when Russell met with Tracy's sister, Bonita Patrick, who lived 3 states away and had limited contact with the family. "Bonita, I need you to know that I'm not trying to turn the family against Tracy," Russell said during their phone call. "But Emma needs stability right now, and I can't have her exposed to people who might undermine her recovery from this trauma." The subtext was clear: support Tracy and lose access to Emma. Douglas and Francine Chandler were Russell's greatest allies in this campaign. The former judge's reputation and connections gave credibility to Russell's version of events, while Francine's maternal instincts focused entirely on protecting Emma from further harm. "That girl is innocent in all this," Francine told her bridge club, her voice breaking. "Russell is doing everything he can to shield her from the truth about her mother." The custody battle was swift and decisive. With Tracy facing murder conspiracy charges and being held without bail, Russell was awarded full custody with Douglas and Francine as approved caregivers when Russell traveled for work. But Russell wasn't content with legal victory. He wanted psychological destruction. He began visiting Austin in jail, using his status as the victim to gain access for what the guards believed were confrontation sessions meant to provide closure. "She's blaming everything on you," Russell told Austin during their first meeting. "Tracy's attorney is building a defense that portrays you as the predator who seduced her and planted the murder ideas." Austin looked haggard, his muscular frame diminished by jail food and stress. "That's not true. Tracy, she said you were hurting her. She said she was afraid of you." Russell's expression remained calm, sympathetic even. "Austin, I never laid a hand on my wife. We had problems, like any marriage, but violence was never part of our relationship. Tracy lied to you about that, just like she lied about everything else. I don't understand. Why would she? Because she's a narcissist who wanted everything: the security of marriage, the excitement of an affair, and eventually the freedom of widowhood with a nice insurance payout. You were just a tool to her." Russell leaned forward, his voice taking on a fatherly tone. "Son, you're 28 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you. Don't throw it away protecting a woman who is using you from day one." The seeds of doubt Russell planted grew over the following weeks. Austin began to question every conversation he'd had with Tracy, every promise she'd made, every moment of their relationship. Had she really loved him, or had he been nothing more than a pawn in a larger game? When Julius Haynes presented the plea agreement that would require Austin to testify against Tracy, Austin was psychologically prepared to accept it. Russell's manipulation of the justice system was masterful. He'd created a situation where the evidence against Tracy was overwhelming, her support system was destroyed, and her co-defendant was being turned against her. The legal proceedings were just a formality at this point. But the architect of this destruction wasn't finished building. Phase 3 would ensure that even if Tracy somehow survived the criminal charges, she would have nothing left to return to. Russell Klein had learned that revenge, like architecture, required a solid foundation. He'd spent months laying that foundation, and now it was time to build the structure that would house Tracy's complete destruction. Chapter 5: The Art of Destruction. 3 months into the legal proceedings, Russell Klein had become something of a celebrity in their suburban community. The sympathetic widower, though technically still married to an incarcerated woman, who was bravely raising his daughter while seeking justice for his family's destruction. The local news had done a feature story on Russell titled "A Father's Strength," showing him volunteering at Emma's school and speaking at a domestic violence awareness event. The irony wasn't lost on Russell, though no one else was in on the joke. Emma was thriving under her father's careful attention. Russell had enrolled her in therapy to help her process the trauma of her mother's betrayal. But he'd selected Dr. Cecilia Larkin, a child psychologist whose methods aligned perfectly with Russell's goals. Emma is remarkably resilient, Dr. Larkin told Russell after their latest session. She's processing the concept that her mother isn't the person she thought she was. It's actually quite healthy for a child her age to understand that adults can make terrible choices. Russell nodded gravely. I just want her to understand that what Tracy did wasn't Emma's fault. Children sometimes blame themselves when parents behave badly. What Dr. Larkin didn't know was that Russell had researched her extensively before choosing her. Cecilia Larkin had strong opinions about parental fitness and believed that children were better served by being honest about a parent's failings rather than maintaining comfortable lies. Under Dr. Larkin's guidance, Emma was learning to articulate her feelings about her mother's bad choices. The 7-year-old was developing a vocabulary around betrayal, consequences, and the importance of honesty that would serve Russell's purposes perfectly when the custody evaluations were completed. Meanwhile, Russell's campaign against Austin Hurley had reached its critical phase. He convinced the young man to accept a plea deal that would reduce his sentence from life to 15 years in exchange for testifying against Tracy. But Russell wasn't satisfied with Austin's cooperation. He wanted the man's complete psychological breakdown. Russell's jail visits had become weekly events, each one designed to chip away at Austin's remaining sanity and self-respect. Tracy's been telling people you forced yourself on her, Russell informed Austin during one visit. She's claiming the affair wasn't consensual, that you threatened her if she didn't comply. Austin's face went white. That's not true. We were in love. She said she was going to leave you for me. Did she? Or did she say whatever she needed to say to keep you available for sex? Russell's voice was clinical, detached. Austin, I've been married to Tracy for 9 years. I know how she operates. She tells people what they want to hear, and she's very convincing about it. Russell pulled out his phone and showed Austin a photo, one of Tracy laughing with Russell at a charity event, taken just days before one of her supposed miserable marriage conversations with Austin. This was taken the night before she told you I'd been cruel to her about some work event. Does she look like an abused woman to you? Austin stared at the photo, his worldview crumbling. The woman laughing in Russell's arms looked nothing like the trapped, desperate wife he thought he'd been rescuing. She's been manipulating both of us, Russell continued. The difference is, I figured it out before she could destroy me completely. The psychological pressure Russell applied was relentless and sophisticated. He understood that Austin's sense of identity was built around being a protector, a rescuer of women in distress. By systematically destroying that self-image, Russell was removing the foundation of Austin's will to fight. Your family back in Ohio, Russell said during another visit. They've been getting some interesting mail lately. Austin looked up sharply. What kind of mail? Court documents, news clippings, photos. I thought they should understand exactly what kind of man their son has become. The cruelty was precise. Russell had indeed been sending Austin's family carefully curated information about the case, ensuring they received the most damaging interpretations of their son's actions. Austin's parents, simple people who ran a small farm, were devastated by the shame their son had brought to the family name. They won't take my calls anymore, Austin whispered. Can you blame them? You conspired to murder a husband and father. You helped plan to steal a child from her home. What parent wants to be associated with that? Russell's voice carried false sympathy. But it's not too late to do the right thing. Testify honestly about how Tracy manipulated you. Accept responsibility for your poor judgment, and maybe someday your family can forgive you. The plea negotiation was Russell's masterpiece of legal manipulation. He met with District Attorney Douglas Burnett to discuss the terms, positioning himself as the magnanimous victim willing to show mercy to the younger, more easily manipulated defendant. I don't want to see Austin's life completely destroyed, Russell told Burnett. He's young, and Tracy is an expert manipulator. If he's willing to tell the truth about how she seduced him into this scheme, I think justice will be served with a 15-year sentence. Burnett was impressed by Russell's apparent forgiveness. That's very generous of you, Mr. Klein. Most men in your position would want maximum sentences for both defendants. I'm thinking about Emma, Russell replied. A long trial with both defendants fighting the charges will be traumatic for her. If Austin pleads out and testifies against Tracy, we can resolve this more quickly. What Burnett didn't understand was that Russell wanted Austin's testimony because it would eliminate any chance of Tracy mounting a successful defense. With her co-defendant confirming the prosecution's narrative, Tracy would have no credible way to claim innocence. The strategy worked perfectly. Austin's attorney presented the plea deal as their best option, and after weeks of psychological pressure from Russell's visits, Austin was ready to accept any path that might lead to eventual redemption. The day Austin signed the plea agreement, Russell felt a deep satisfaction. Not because justice was being served, but because another piece of his architectural revenge was falling into place. Tracy's isolation was now complete. Her co-defendant had turned against her, her family had abandoned her, her friends had rejected her, and her daughter was being systematically reprogrammed to see her as a monster. But Russell's most devastating move was yet to come. He arranged a meeting with Tracy's defense attorney, Madeline Sanford, ostensibly to discuss a possible plea arrangement for Tracy as well. "My client maintains her innocence," Madeline told Russell in the courthouse conference room. She claims she's never seen these documents before, that the handwriting analysis is wrong, that someone is framing her. Russell nodded sympathetically. "Madeline, I understand that Tracy needs to maintain her innocence for psychological reasons. Accepting that she planned to murder me and kidnap Emma would probably break her completely. Are you saying you believe she's innocent?" "I'm saying that I loved Tracy for 9 years, and I want to believe that somewhere inside her is the woman I married. If she's willing to accept responsibility for the affair and the financial fraud, and if she agrees to relinquish all parental rights to Emma, I might be willing to consider supporting a plea to lesser charges." Madeline leaned forward, intrigued. "What kind of lesser charges?" "Fraud, conspiracy, reckless endangerment. Maybe she could be out in 7 to 10 years instead of life." But Russell's offer came with conditions that were designed to be unacceptable to any mother. Complete termination of parental rights, a restraining order preventing any contact with Emma, and a public admission of guilt that would destroy any remaining shred of her reputation. She'd never see her daughter again? Madeline asked. "Emma has been through enough trauma. Having a mother who conspired to murder her father isn't something a child should have to live with." When Madeline presented the offer to Tracy, the reaction was exactly what Russell had anticipated. "I'd rather die in prison than give up my rights to Emma," Tracy said through tears. "And I'm not admitting to crimes I didn't commit." The refusal was perfect for Russell's purposes. It would be presented to the jury as evidence of Tracy's continued selfishness and lack of remorse. What kind of mother would choose pride over a chance to someday have a relationship with her child? As Austin's testimony date approached, Russell made one final visit to the broken young man. "Tomorrow, you'll have a chance to tell the truth," Russell said. "To explain how Tracy manipulated you, how she played on your emotions, and convince you to participate in her scheme." Austin nodded miserably. "I just want this to be over." "It will be," Russell assured him. "And Austin, when you're released in 15 years, you'll still be young enough to build a real life. A life based on honesty instead of lies." Russell left the jail feeling a deep sense of completion. The trial was a formality now. Tracy would be convicted, Austin would serve his reduced sentence, and Russell would emerge as the heroic survivor who protected his daughter from a mother's ultimate betrayal. But the architect wasn't quite finished with his blueprint. There was one final element to put in place, one last detail that would ensure his revenge was not just complete, but permanent. Russell Klein had always believed that the best structures were built to last forever. Chapter 6: The Perfect Witness. The morning of Austin Hurley's testimony arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made Russell think of new beginnings. He dressed carefully for court. A navy suit that conveyed both professionalism and quiet grief, a tie that Emma had given him for Father's Day, and the wedding ring he still wore despite everything. Emma wouldn't be in court today. Russell had arranged for her to spend the day with her grandparents, carefully explaining that Mommy's friend, would be talking to the judge about the bad things they'd planned together. The 7-year-old had nodded solemnly, her trust in her father's version of events absolute. The courthouse was packed with media and curious onlookers. The case had captured the public imagination, a beautiful suburban mother and her young lover plotting to murder her successful husband. It was the kind of story that sold newspapers and generated online discussions about the darkness lurking behind perfect picket fences. Russell took his usual seat in the front row, directly in Tracy's line of sight. She looked fragile in her orange jumpsuit, her once perfect blonde hair now grown out and showing dark roots. When their eyes met, he saw desperation there, and something else. A growing realization that the trap she was in had been constructed with architectural precision. Austin took the stand, looking like a different person from the confident personal trainer Russell had first observed at the gym. Prison had hollowed out his cheeks and dulled his eyes, but it was the psychological pressure that had truly broken him. District Attorney Douglas Burnett led Austin through his testimony with careful precision, each question designed to build the narrative of manipulation and murder conspiracy. Mr. Hurley, how did your relationship with Mrs. Klein begin? Austin's voice was barely above a whisper. She started coming to my classes at the gym. She seemed sad, lonely. She said her husband was cold, that he didn't appreciate her. Did she tell you she was unhappy in her marriage? Yes. She said Russell was controlling, that he monitored her spending and questioned where she went. She made it sound like she was trapped. Russell maintained his composure, but inside he felt the satisfaction of watching his carefully constructed narrative unfold. Every detail Austin recounted had been fed to Tracy by Russell himself through his own behavior and calculated comments. When did the relationship become physical? After about 6 weeks. She said she needed to feel wanted, appreciated. She said Russell made her feel like she was just there to take care of Emma and look good at his business events. The testimony continued for 3 hours, with Austin describing their affair in clinical detail. But the most damaging testimony came when Burnett moved to the alleged murder plot. Mr. Hurley, did Mrs. Klein ever discuss her husband's life insurance policy? Yes. She said he'd recently increased it to $2 million. She thought it was strange because he'd never shown much interest in life insurance before. Russell had indeed increased his policy, but only after planning the idea with Tracy that he was worried about business rivals who might want to harm him. She'd encouraged him to protect his family, never realizing she was being maneuvered into a position where her knowledge of the policy would later seem suspicious. Did Mrs. Klein suggest that you and she could be together permanently if her husband was no longer alive? Austin nodded miserably. She said Russell would never agree to a divorce because he was too proud. She said he'd rather destroy her than let her be happy with someone else. Did she propose a specific plan for her husband's death? This was the crucial moment, and Russell leaned forward slightly to hear Austin's response. She said it had to look like an accident. She talked about his morning runs, how he always took the same route through the park. She said if something happened to him there, like a mugging gone wrong, no one would suspect anything. The courtroom was silent as Austin described plans that existed only in Russell's imagination, but had been carefully fed to Tracy through staged conversations and planted suggestions. Russell had indeed started running in the park, and he made sure Tracy knew his route and schedule. Mr. Hurley, did you agree to participate in this plan? Yes. I thought I was helping her escape from an abusive situation. She made me believe that Russell was dangerous, that he might hurt her or Emma if he found out about us. The defense attorney, Madeline Sanford, had a nearly impossible task in cross-examination. Austin's testimony was internally consistent and supported by the physical evidence. Her only strategy was to suggest that he was lying to reduce his sentence, but Austin's obvious emotional distress made him appear credible. Mr. Hurley, isn't it true that you're only testifying against Mrs. Klein because the prosecution promised you a reduced sentence? I'm testifying because I want to tell the truth about what happened. Tracy manipulated me, but I was stupid enough to go along with it. I deserve to be punished for that. You claim Mrs. Klein was the mastermind of this alleged plot, but isn't it possible that you were the one who suggested killing her husband? Austin looked directly at Tracy for the first time during his testimony. I loved her. I thought she loved me. I would have done anything she asked, including things I knew were wrong. That's on me, but the ideas came from her. When Austin's testimony concluded, Russell watched Tracy's reaction carefully. She was shaking her head slightly, mouthing the word no over and over. The woman who'd once seemed so confident in her ability to manipulate situations was finally understanding how completely she'd been outmaneuvered. During the lunch break, Russell encountered Madeline Sanford in the courthouse hallway. Mr. Klein, I need to ask you directly. Are you certain my client is guilty of these charges? Russell's expression was perfectly calibrated. Madeline, I know this is difficult for you. Tracy can be very convincing when she wants something, but the evidence speaks for itself. The evidence that you discovered, the handwriting that matches hers, the bank account that has her signature, the conversations that happen to be recorded by your security system. Russell nodded sadly. I wish none of this were true. I wish I could believe that someone else was responsible. But Tracy made choices that put our entire family at risk. What Madeline couldn't know was that every piece of evidence she'd mentioned had been meticulously crafted by Russell over months of patient work. The handwriting had been practiced until it was indistinguishable from Tracy's. The bank signatures had been forged using techniques Russell had learned from a former client who was a document examiner. The recordings had been edited and manipulated to support the narrative Russell wanted to tell. The afternoon session focused on the physical evidence, the letter, the bank records, the photographs. Each piece was presented as if it were an independent corroboration of Austin's testimony, when in reality all of it had been manufactured by the same architect. When court adjourned for the day, Russell approached the prosecutor. How do you think it went? He asked Burnett. Very well. Austin was credible, and his testimony corroborates all our physical evidence. Your wife's attorney is competent, but she doesn't have much to work with. Russell nodded. I just want this to be over. Emma needs closure, and frankly, so do I. That evening, Russell sat in his study reviewing the day's events with the satisfaction of a craftsman admiring his work. Austin's testimony had been perfect, detailed enough to be convincing, emotional enough to be sympathetic, and consistent enough to be unshakable. But Russell's masterpiece wasn't the testimony itself. It was the psychological manipulation that had made Austin believe every word he was saying. The young man genuinely thought Tracy had manipulated him into a murder plot because Russell had spent months convincing him that was the truth. The real genius of Russell's plan was that it contained enough elements of truth to be believable. Tracy had been unfaithful. She had complained about their marriage. She had known about the insurance policy. Austin had been willing to do anything to please her. Russell had simply taken those true elements and constructed a narrative around them that served his purposes. It was like architectural drafting. You start with the foundation of reality and build the structure you want on top of it. As Russell prepared for bed, he thought about the next day's proceedings. The prosecution would rest its case, and Madeline Sanford would begin her defense. But what defense could she mount against evidence that appeared ironclad and testimony that seemed heartfelt? Tracy's fate was sealed. She would be convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to life in prison. Austin would serve his 15 years and emerge a broken man who would never fully recover from his role in destroying a family. And Russell would continue his life as the heroic single father who'd protected his daughter from a mother's ultimate betrayal. The architect had built his masterpiece, and it was a thing of terrible beauty. Chapter 7. The defense crumbles. Tracy Klein's defense lasted exactly 2.5 days, which was longer than most court observers had expected. Madeline Sanford fought valiantly for her client, but she was battling against evidence that appeared unshakable and testimony that had left little room for reasonable doubt. The defense strategy centered on the argument that Tracy was being framed, but without being able to identify who would have the means and motive to construct such an elaborate deception. The theory sounded like desperate speculation. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Madeline said in her opening statement, my client is the victim of a sophisticated frame job. Someone with intimate knowledge of her life, her handwriting, and her daily routines has constructed a web of false evidence designed to destroy her. Russell sat in the gallery, his expression one of pained attention. To the observers, he appeared to be a man listening to his wife's attorney grasp at straws to avoid accountability. Only Russell knew that Madeleine was actually closer to the truth than anyone else in the courtroom. The defense's first witness was a handwriting expert named Dr. Troy Piper, whom Madeleine had hoped would cast doubt on the authenticity of the letter allegedly written by Tracy. Dr. Piper, in your analysis of a letter attributed to Mrs. Cline, did you find any evidence that it was forged? The handwriting is extremely consistent with known samples of Mrs. Cline's writing. However, there are some subtle anomalies that could suggest either forgery or writing under stress. District Attorney Burnett was ready for this line of defense. Dr. Piper, isn't it true that handwriting can change when someone is writing about emotionally charged subjects? Yes, stress and emotional state can affect handwriting characteristics. And if someone were planning to murder their spouse, that would certainly qualify as an emotionally charged situation, wouldn't it? The expert had to agree, and Russell watched Madeleine's first line of defense crumble under cross-examination. The defense's second witness was Tracy's sister, Bonita Patrick, who testified via video link from her home in Kansas. Madeleine had hoped Bonita would provide character testimony that would make the murder conspiracy seem implausible. Ms. Patrick, in your experience with your sister, have you ever known her to be violent or vindictive? Never. Tracy was one of the gentlest people I know. She wouldn't hurt a fly. But Burnett's cross-examination revealed that Bonita hadn't spoken to Tracy in over 6 months and had no knowledge of her marriage problems or the affair. Ms. Patrick, when was the last time you had a meaningful conversation with your sister about her marriage? It's been, well, probably over a year. We don't talk very often, so you wouldn't know if Mrs. Cline was unhappy in her marriage or if she was having an affair? No, I suppose I wouldn't. Russell had deliberately limited Tracy's contact with her extended family over the years, subtly discouraging visits and phone calls. By the time of the trial, no one in Tracy's family had enough recent knowledge of her life to provide meaningful character testimony. The defense's most desperate move was putting Tracy herself on the stand. Russell had been waiting for this moment, curious to see if his wife would finally understand the scope of what had been done to her. Tracy was sworn in wearing the same orange jumpsuit she'd worn for months, but Madeleine had arranged for her to have her hair done by the jail's beautician. She looked more like the woman Russell had married, which made her claims of innocence seem more credible. Mrs. Cline, did you write the letter that allegedly details a plan to kill your husband? No, I did not. I've never seen that letter before in my life. Did you open a secret bank account to fund a murder plot? No. I opened an account to help Austin with his business plans, but there was never any discussion of hurting Russell. Did you have an affair with Austin Hurley? Tracy's voice broke slightly. Yes, I was unfaithful to my husband, and I regret that deeply, but I never wanted to hurt him. Russell watched Tracy's testimony with professional interest. She was actually quite good on the stand, sincere, remorseful about the affair, but adamant about her innocence regarding the murder plot. If the physical evidence hadn't been so damning, she might have been believable. Mrs. Cline, Austin Hurley testified that you approached him with the idea of killing your husband. Is that true? No, it's not true. Austin is lying to save himself. I loved him, and I thought he loved me, but he's willing to destroy me to reduce his sentence. Madeleine was building toward her closing argument theme, that Austin was the real mastermind who had manipulated Tracy, not the other way around. It was a reasonable strategy given the circumstances, but it required the jury to believe that Austin's emotional breakdown on the stand had been an act. The cross-examination was where Russell's planning truly shone. District Attorney Burnett had been thoroughly prepared for every possible defense strategy. Mrs. Cline, you admit you lied to your husband about your whereabouts for months during your affair? Yes. You admit you took money from your family's accounts to give to Mr. Hurley without your husband's knowledge? Yes, but it was for his business, not for any murder plot. You admit you discussed your husband's life insurance policy with Mr. Hurley? I mentioned it, yes, but not in the context Austin described. So you're admitting to systematic deception, financial fraud, and intimate discussions about your husband's death benefit with your lover. But you want the jury to believe you drew the line at murder? Tracy's credibility crumbled under the weight of her admitted lies and deceptions. Even her claims of innocence regarding the murder plot seemed less believable when viewed against the pattern of dishonesty she'd established in other areas. Russell's favorite moment came when Burnett questioned Tracy about her knowledge of Russell's daily routines. "Mrs. Klein, your husband testified that you encouraged him to increase his life insurance because you were concerned about his safety. Is that true?" "Yes, I was worried about him. He'd been working on some controversial projects, and he mentioned that some people weren't happy with his designs. And you knew his running route through the park?" "Of course. We discussed it many times. I worried about him running alone so early in the morning." What Tracy didn't realize was that by confirming her knowledge of Russell's routines and her encouragement regarding the insurance, she was corroborating key elements of the prosecution's case. Russell had fed her those concerns about his safety specifically so she would later appear to have inside knowledge that supported the murder plot. The final nail in the coffin came when Burnett asked about the night of discovery at her parents' house. "Mrs. Klein, your daughter was the one who noticed the envelope under the table. Are you suggesting that your 7-year-old child was part of some conspiracy to frame you?" "No, of course not. Emma is innocent. But someone put that envelope there knowing she would find it." "Who, Mrs. Klein? Who would have access to your parents' house, knowledge of your family dinner plans, and the ability to plant evidence without being detected?" Tracy looked directly at Russell for the first time during her testimony. In that moment, Russell saw recognition dawn in her eyes. She finally understood who had orchestrated her destruction. Tracy started to speak, then stopped. She couldn't accuse Russell without sounding completely delusional. He was the victim, the grieving husband, the protective father. No one would believe that he had framed his own wife for attempted murder. "I don't know," Tracy finished weakly. Russell smiled slightly, a gesture so brief that only Tracy caught it. But it was enough to confirm what she'd just realized. When Tracy was dismissed from the stand, she looked like a woman who had finally understood the full scope of her doom. Russell had not only destroyed her marriage and her reputation, he had constructed a legal and social reality where she was powerless to defend herself against his accusations. The closing arguments were anticlimactic. Burnett methodically reviewed the evidence and Austin's testimony, painting a picture of a cold-blooded conspiracy that had been stopped just in time by a father's determination to protect his child. Madeline's closing was passionate but futile. She argued that the evidence was too neat, the timeline too convenient, and Austin's testimony too self-serving to be credible. But without being able to offer an alternative explanation that made sense, her arguments sounded like the desperate attempts of a defense attorney who knew her client was doomed. Russell left the courthouse that day knowing the jury would convict. The only question was whether they would recommend life in prison or the death penalty. As he drove home to Emma, Russell reflected on the perfection of his achievement. Tracy would spend the rest of her life in prison for crimes she didn't commit, but crimes that everyone believed she had committed. Austin would serve 15 years and emerge as a broken shell of his former self. And Russell would raise Emma to understand that her mother had been a monster who had tried to destroy their family. The architect had built something unprecedented, a revenge so complete and so perfectly constructed that even its victims couldn't fully comprehend its scope. Chapter 8. The Verdict. The jury deliberated for 8 hours across 2 days. Russell spent the time maintaining his routine, taking Emma to school, meeting with clients, and appearing to live the life of a man waiting for justice to be served. But inside, he was running calculations, considering contingencies, and preparing for the final phase of his plan. Emma had been asking more questions about the trial lately, her 7-year-old mind trying to process why Mommy was in jail and why Daddy looked sad all the time. "When will we know if Mommy did the bad things?" she asked over breakfast on the morning of the second day of deliberations. Russell carefully buttered her toast, using the mundane task to mask his satisfaction. "Soon, sweetheart. The people on the jury are thinking very carefully about all the things they heard in court. Will Mommy come home if they decide she didn't do the bad things? This was the question Russell had been preparing for. Emma, sometimes grown-ups do things that hurt other people, even when they love those people. Mommy made choices that hurt our family, and now she has to face the consequences of those choices. It was a masterful non-answer that left Emma with the impression that Tracy's guilt was not in question, only the severity of her punishment. At 3:47 p.m. on the second day, Russell received the call that the jury had reached a verdict. He arranged for Emma to stay with her grandparents and drove to the courthouse with the measured pace of a man who wasn't entirely sure what news awaited him. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. The case had captured national attention as an example of suburban evil hidden behind perfect facades. Russell took his usual seat in the front row, noting that Tracy looked smaller somehow, as if the weeks of imprisonment and public scrutiny had physically diminished her. When the jury foreman stood to read the verdict, the courtroom fell silent except for the sound of Tracy's quiet sobbing. We, the jury, find the defendant, Tracy Chandler Kline, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree. Russell closed his eyes briefly, not in relief, but in satisfaction at another precisely executed element of his design. We, the jury, find the defendant, Tracy Chandler Kline, guilty of conspiracy to commit kidnapping in the first degree. Tracy's sobbing grew louder, and Madeline Sanford put a comforting hand on her client's shoulder. We, the jury, find the defendant, Tracy Chandler Kline, guilty of fraud in the first degree. When the foreman finished reading all 7 guilty verdicts, Russell stood with the rest of the courtroom as the judge dismissed the jury. He made eye contact with several jurors, nodding his appreciation for their service with the dignity expected from a victim who had finally received justice. Outside the courthouse, Russell gave a brief statement to the assembled media. "I want to thank the jury for their careful consideration of this case," he said, his voice steady but carrying undertones of grief. "My focus now is on healing and moving forward with my daughter. Emma has been through tremendous trauma, and she deserves the chance to grow up without the shadow of her mother's choices hanging over her life." A reporter called out, "Mr. Kline, do you feel justice has been served?" Russell paused, as if considering the weight of the question. "Justice for our family means that Emma will grow up safe, knowing that her father will always protect her from people who would harm her. In that sense, yes, justice has been served." The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, giving Russell time to prepare for the final act of his revenge. During those weeks, he met with victim impact coordinators, drafted his statement for the court, and continued the delicate work of reshaping Emma's understanding of her family's history. He also made one final visit to Austin Hurley, who was awaiting transfer to state prison to begin serving his 15-year sentence. "I wanted to see you before you were transferred," Russell told the broken young man, "to thank you for telling the truth about what Tracy did to both of us." Austin looked up with hollow eyes. "I keep thinking about how she played me, how she made me believe I was saving her when really she was using me to help plan your murder." Russell nodded sympathetically. "Tracy is an expert manipulator. If it makes you feel any better, she fooled me for 9 years before I started to see who she really was. Do you think she ever loved me at all?" The question was pathetic in its neediness, and Russell almost felt sorry for the man he'd systematically destroyed. "Almost. I think Tracy loves only herself," Russell said. "Everyone else is just a tool to get what she wants." When Russell left the jail that day, he knew Austin would spend the next 15 years replaying their conversations, becoming more convinced with each passing year that he had been the victim of a master manipulator rather than the unknowing pawn in someone else's game of revenge. The sentencing hearing drew an even larger crowd than the verdict. Russell had prepared a victim impact statement that he'd practiced until every pause and inflection conveyed the perfect balance of pain and strength. "Your Honor," Russell began, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom, "Tracy Kline was my wife for 9 years and the mother of my daughter. For most of that time, I believed I knew who she was. I thought I was married to a loving woman who shared my values and my commitment to our family." Russell paused, looking directly at Tracy for the first time since the trial began. "The woman sitting before you is a stranger to me. The Tracy I thought I married would never have betrayed our family. She would never have conspired to murder the father of her child. She would never have planned to steal our daughter from the only stable home she's ever known." Tracy was crying openly now, but Russell continued with clinical precision. "Emma asks me every day when Mommy is coming home. How do I tell a 7-year-old that Mommy planned to kill Daddy? How do I explain that the person she trusted most in the world was willing to destroy her family for selfish desires?" Russell's voice broke slightly, a calculated display of emotion that had taken weeks to perfect. "Your Honor, I'm not asking for vengeance. I'm asking for protection. Emma needs to grow up knowing that the people who claim to love her will never betray that trust. She needs to understand that actions have consequences, and that even people we love must be held accountable when they choose evil over good." When Russell finished his statement, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. He had painted himself as the noble victim, Tracy as the manipulative predator, and Emma as the innocent child who needed protection from her own mother. Judge Wendell Warren, no relation to Russell's attorney, had presided over hundreds of sentencing hearings, but this case had clearly affected him personally. "Mrs. Klein," the judge said, his voice heavy with disgust, "you have committed crimes that strike at the very foundation of family and society. You betrayed your husband's trust, endangered your child's welfare, and conspired to commit the ultimate crime against the man who provided for and protected you." Tracy tried to speak, to offer some final plea for mercy or understanding, but the judge cut her off. "You had every opportunity to choose a different path. You could have sought marriage counseling, filed for divorce, or simply ended your affair and recommitted to your family. Instead, you chose murder and kidnapping as solutions to your marital problems." Russell watched Tracy's face as the judge pronounced sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder conspiracy, 25 years for the kidnapping conspiracy, and 10 years for fraud, all sentences to run consecutively. Tracy Klein would die in prison. As the bailiffs led Tracy away in shackles, she looked back at Russell one final time. In her eyes, he saw complete understanding of what had been done to her, and complete helplessness to change it. Russell left the courthouse that day as a widower, though technically still married to a woman who would spend the rest of her life in a maximum security prison. Emma would grow up believing her mother was a monster who had tried to destroy their family. That evening, Russell sat in his study reviewing architectural plans for a new project while Emma played in the next room. The life he'd constructed around them was perfect now. No complications, no betrayals, no messy emotions to navigate. He had built the ultimate structure, a reality where he was the hero, Tracy was the villain, and Emma was the innocent victim who needed his protection. It was a masterpiece of psychological architecture, and it would last for the rest of their lives. Russell Klein had learned that revenge, properly executed, wasn't about destroying your enemies. It was about constructing a new reality where your enemies destroyed themselves, and you emerged as the righteous survivor. Chapter 9. The Perfect Life. 5 years had passed since Tracy Klein's sentencing, and Russell had constructed what appeared to be the perfect life from the ashes of his family's destruction. Emma, now 12, was thriving academically and socially, with no apparent trauma from her mother's betrayal. Russell had received the Father of the Year award from the city's Family Services Organization and had been featured in parenting magazines as an example of how single fathers could provide stability for their children. The architectural firm had expanded into 3 states, largely due to the sympathy and admiration Russell had garnered as the man who'd survived his wife's attempt to murder him. Clients trusted him not just with their buildings, but with their stories of family difficulties and business challenges. Russell Klein had become the go-to architect for people who needed to rebuild their lives. Emma's relationship with her paternal grandparents, Douglas and Francine Chandler, had evolved exactly as Russell had planned. They saw themselves as her protectors against the truth about her mother, and they competed with Russell to provide her with love and stability. Emma was surrounded by adults who were invested in maintaining the narrative that her father was a hero and her mother was a monster. Daddy, Jessica's mom asked me about Mommy again today, Emma said over dinner one evening. At 12, she was developing the angular features that reminded Russell of Tracy, but her personality was pure Klein, analytical, controlled, and loyal to family. What did you tell her? Russell asked, cutting his steak with surgical precision. I told her that Mommy made bad choices and now she's in prison for trying to hurt people. Jessica's mom said she was sorry, and I told her it was okay because you take better care of me than Mommy ever did. Russell smiled with genuine warmth. You handled that very well, sweetheart. Some people don't understand that families can be better after removing dangerous people from them. This was the conversation Russell had been cultivating for 5 years. Emma didn't remember her early childhood with Tracy clearly, and the narrative Russell had constructed had replaced most of her positive memories. In Emma's mind, her mother had always been unstable, selfish, and potentially dangerous. The few times Emma asked about visiting Tracy in prison, Russell had gently explained that it wouldn't be healthy for either of them. Mommy is still the same person who planned to hurt our family, he would say. She might try to manipulate you or lie to you about what really happened. My job is to protect you from that kind of psychological damage. Emma had stopped asking about visits years ago. Russell's social life had evolved as well. He'd dated occasionally, always women who were impressed by his devotion to Emma and his tragic backstory. He never let any relationship develop too seriously, claiming that Emma needed his full attention during her formative years. The truth was that Russell had no interest in remarrying. He had learned that marriage required trust and vulnerability, and he was incapable of either. The systematic destruction of Tracy had revealed something fundamental about his own nature. He was most comfortable when he had complete control over his environment and the people in it. Austin Hurley had been released from prison the previous year after serving 10 years of his 15-year sentence for good behavior. Russell had kept track of his former enemy through various sources, and the reports were exactly what he'd expected. Austin had emerged from prison as a broken man. His family in Ohio wanted nothing to do with him. His prospects for employment were limited by his criminal record, and his confidence had been completely shattered by years of believing he'd been manipulated into a murder conspiracy. Russell had arranged for one of his business associates to hire Austin for manual labor at a construction site, not out of charity, but because he wanted to observe the final results of his psychological warfare. Austin worked as a day laborer, lived in a halfway house, and spent his evenings at Alcoholics Anonymous meetings trying to make sense of how his life had gone so wrong. The man who had once been confident enough to seduce another man's wife now flinched when spoken to directly and apologized for taking up space in conversations. Russell's masterpiece was complete. The only loose thread in Russell's perfect construction was Tracy herself. She had spent 5 years in maximum security prison, and the reports Russell received through his connections in the legal community suggested that she had not adapted well to incarceration. Tracy had been attacked twice by other inmates who viewed her as a child-endangering monster. She spent most of her time in protective custody, with limited human contact and no possibility of appeal. Her initial claims of innocence had been replaced by a kind of catatonic acceptance of her fate. The prison psychologist's reports, which Russell obtained through carefully cultivated relationships, indicated that Tracy showed signs of severe depression and had made multiple suicide attempts. She rarely spoke to anyone and spent her days staring at the walls of her cell. Russell felt no sympathy for her suffering. Tracy had chosen to betray their family, and this was simply the natural consequence of that choice. On the 5th anniversary of Tracy's sentencing, Russell took Emma to dinner at the same restaurant where he'd proposed to Tracy 15 years earlier. It was a deliberate choice, a way of reclaiming a space that had once held significance in his relationship with a woman who was now dying slowly in a prison cell. "Daddy, do you ever miss being married?" Emma asked as they waited for dessert. Russell considered the question carefully. "I miss the idea of being married to someone trustworthy, but I learned that some people are better at pretending to be good than actually being good. Do you think you'll ever get married again?" "Maybe someday, when you're older and don't need as much of my attention. But I'd be very careful to choose someone who shared our values and who would never try to hurt our family." Emma nodded seriously. I think you should only marry someone who loves me too, not just someone who pretends to love me to get to you. Russell's smile was genuine. That's very wise, sweetheart. You're already better at reading people than I was at your age. This was the ultimate victory. Not just Tracy's destruction, but Emma's transformation into someone who would never make Tracy's mistakes. Russell was raising a daughter who understood that loyalty was paramount, that betrayal was unforgivable, and that some people deserved everything bad that happened to them. Later that evening, Russell sat in his study reviewing blueprints for a new residential development. The project was massive, 200 homes for families looking to build perfect lives in a controlled environment. Russell would design their houses, their community spaces, and their security systems. He understood now that his true calling wasn't just architecture, it was social engineering on a grand scale. He was in the business of creating perfect structures for perfect lives, and he had the skills to eliminate anything that threatened that perfection. As he worked, Russell thought about Tracy, sitting in her cell 500 miles away, probably staring at the ceiling and wondering how her life had gone so catastrophically wrong. She would never understand that her destruction hadn't been the result of bad luck or poor choices. It had been the inevitable consequence of betraying Russell Klein. Emma was upstairs doing homework, secure in the knowledge that her father would always protect her from people like her mother. She would grow up strong, successful, and completely loyal to the man who had saved her from the woman who had given birth to her. Russell Klein had built the perfect life from the ruins of an imperfect marriage. He had eliminated betrayal, created absolute loyalty, and constructed a reality where he was the unquestioned hero of his own story. It was his greatest architectural achievement, and it would last forever. The phone rang, interrupting his work. It was Douglas Chandler, calling to check on Emma and to share news from his legal connections. Russell, my boy, I thought you should know. I heard from a friend who works in the prison system. Tracy has been moved to the psychiatric wing. Apparently, she's been having some kind of breakdown. Russell's pen paused over his blueprints. Is she dangerous? No, nothing like that. She's been claiming that she's innocent, that someone framed her. Complete delusion, of course. The psychiatrists think she's having trouble accepting responsibility for what she did. Russell smiled. Even in her madness, Tracy was still trying to tell the truth. But truth was just another construction material, and Russell had built something more powerful than truth. He had built consensus reality. That's sad, but not surprising, Russell told his former father-in-law. Some people would rather go insane than accept the consequences of their actions. Exactly. Well, I just wanted you to know in case it ever comes up with Emma. Though I don't see why it would. Thank you for keeping me informed, Douglas. Emma and I both appreciate how you and Francine have supported us through all this. After ending the call, Russell returned to his blueprints with renewed focus. Tracy's final breakdown was just confirmation that his construction was complete and permanent. He had destroyed her so thoroughly that even she no longer trusted her own memories of what had actually happened. Russell Klein had built the perfect revenge, and now he was living in the perfect life that revenge had made possible. The architect's work was done. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.